He was the kind of boy who didn't quite fit in anywhere. While other kids ran around chasing each other after school, he preferred to sit quietly with a pencil in his hand, staring at the lines he drew on a piece of paper. Sometimes he would draw circles inside circles, then turn them into triangles and squares, trying to see how shapes connected. He didn't know why he loved doing it. It just made sense to him. At school, teachers called him curious but strange. He didn't talk much, and when he did, he asked questions that didn't sound normal for a child his age. One time during a math lesson, the teacher was explaining how to divide apples among friends. He raised his hand and asked, "What if the apple isn't a perfect circle?" The class laughed. The teacher smiled awkwardly and said, "We don't need to think that way here." But he couldn't stop thinking that way. At home, his parents didn't fully understand him either. They loved him, but they often worried. His father worked long hours and believed success meant scoring high marks in school and finding a good job someday. His mother, gentle and kind, tried to help him with his homework, but even she got confused when he started talking about patterns hidden behind simple numbers. She would listen and nod even when she didn't really get it. He didn't have many friends. Kids his age liked games, jokes, and stories. He liked patterns. But sometimes when he walked home after school, he would see numbers everywhere. The way the tiles on the sidewalk lined up, the way the branches of a tree split into smaller parts, or how raindrops fell in uneven but familiar distances. The world looked alive to him, not with color or sound, but with rhythm and structure. He wasn't a top student. In fact, most teachers thought he was average. He didn't memorize formulas easily, and he often solved problems in his own unusual way. When asked to show his working, his methods were so different that teachers marked them wrong, even if the answers were right. Still, he didn't argue. He just nodded and moved on. One evening, he sat by his window watching the sunset. The golden light filled his room, casting long shadows on the floor. He looked at his notebook, filled with sketches of numbers and shapes. He wondered if any of it mattered. Nobody else cared about these little discoveries he made. Maybe he was wasting his time. But deep inside, he felt something, like a quiet voice whispering that there was meaning behind it all, that one day he'd understand why he saw the world differently. Years went by. He entered high school. The subjects got harder and expectations heavier. Most students studied to get grades. He studied to satisfy his curiosity, but curiosity didn't help much during exams. He often got stuck because he would start thinking about why the formula worked instead of just using it. Teachers saw that as distraction. "You think too much," they told him. "Just follow the method." He tried, but it didn't feel right. He didn't want to follow. He wanted to understand. Sometimes he'd stay up late, working quietly by the dim light of his table lamp. He'd scribble, erase, rewrite, and draw again. It wasn't about homework anymore. It was about solving the small mysteries that fascinated him. His room was small but filled with notebooks. Each one looked messy to anyone else, but to him they were treasure chests of thoughts. Some pages had strange symbols and half-finished equations. Others had simple drawings of trees, waves, and spirals. He believed nature spoke in numbers. It just needed someone to listen. One day his math teacher introduced a concept called infinity. Most of the class groaned, already confused by the word. But his eyes lit up. He couldn't stop thinking about how something could go on forever. That evening, he filled an entire notebook trying to imagine infinity in shapes and patterns. He wasn't doing it for marks. He was doing it because something inside him burned to know more. Despite his passion, life outside numbers wasn't easy. His family struggled financially. His father grew frustrated, saying, "You spend too much time thinking. Start doing." The boy tried to help by tutoring younger kids after school. Ironically, those kids loved his explanations because he made math feel simple and alive. He didn't make them memorize rules. He showed them why things worked. For the first time, he saw smiles when someone finally understood a concept. It made him happy. Teaching gave his curiosity a purpose. There were moments when doubt crept in. He sometimes wondered if he was strange, if maybe his way of thinking would never matter. The world didn't seem to value imagination unless it made money or fame. But he couldn't stop seeing patterns everywhere. Even during chores or walks, his mind played with invisible puzzles. He began to believe that there must be a reason behind his different way of thinking. During his last year of high school, something changed. A new math competition was announced in his district. It wasn't about memorizing formulas. It was about solving real-world problems using creative thinking. His teacher encouraged the class to join, though most saw it as too difficult. For him, it sounded exciting. Finally, a place where thinking differently might actually help. He joined the competition quietly. He didn't expect to win, but he wanted to try. The question given was complex, something about finding a new way to measure distance when shapes aren't perfect. The other students looked frustrated, flipping through textbooks. He didn't, he just stared at the problem for a long time. Then, without realizing it, he began sketching patterns, lines, and angles the same way he always did as a child. Hours passed. When the judges reviewed his work, they were surprised. His solution wasn't like any other, but it made sense. It was simple yet elegant. He didn't win first prize, but one of the judges, an older professor, noticed him. After the event, the professor approached and asked, "How did you come up with this idea?" The boy shrugged and said, "It just felt right." The professor smiled and said something he would never forget. "Keep feeling right. That's how real discoveries begin." That night he couldn't sleep. For the first time, someone had looked at his strange way of thinking not as foolishness, but as talent. The thought filled him with quiet excitement. He realized maybe he wasn't wrong all along, just early. From then on, his approach to life changed slightly. He started believing that his curiosity was not a weakness but a gift. While others tried to fit into a pattern, he embraced the chaos of his thoughts. He didn't know it yet, but this mindset would one day lead him to a discovery that would make people rethink what mathematics truly meant. But at that time, he was still just a young dreamer. He would sit under the same window where he once doubted himself, staring at the moonlight spilling over his papers. He didn't have fancy tools or mentors, just a pencil, a stack of notebooks, and an unshakable desire to understand the world. He would spend hours watching how things moved, water in a bucket, light reflecting on glass, clouds shifting slowly. He believed everything had a hidden pattern waiting to be found. People around him still didn't understand, but he stopped trying to explain himself. Some things couldn't be explained in words, they had to be discovered. Slowly, he learned to balance his curiosity with the world's expectations. He studied hard, not just to pass, but to learn the rules he would later break. He didn't know that his small sketches and late-night thoughts were shaping his future. To others, they were just doodles. To him, they were windows to something far bigger. The story of how his solution changed mathematics forever didn't begin with brilliance or fame. It began in that small room with a boy who refused to stop wondering. He didn't know it yet, but his way of seeing the world, the way he turned every question into a pattern and every mistake into a lesson, was the seed of something extraordinary. One day, that seed would grow into a discovery so powerful, it would change how people think about mathematics itself. But for now, he was just beginning his journey, quietly, patiently, with eyes that saw meaning where others saw nothing. And that quiet persistence, hidden behind his shy smile and ink-stained hands, would soon lead him toward a future no one could have imagined. University life was nothing like he imagined. It was bigger, louder, and filled with people who seemed so sure of themselves. Everyone there talked about achievements, scholarships, and future plans. He, on the other hand, felt like a small drop in a giant ocean. The classrooms were large, and the professors spoke fast, expecting students to keep up. But he wasn't the kind to memorize and repeat. He liked to pause to understand. And in a place where speed mattered more than depth, that made him feel lost again. Still, he loved the library. It became his second home. The long aisles, the smell of old paper, the quiet whispers between shelves, it gave him peace. While others rushed to complete assignments, he wandered through books that nobody else touched. He read about the history of mathematics, about thinkers who had once been misunderstood just like him. It comforted him to know that even the greatest minds were once doubted by their own teachers. Sometimes he would sit by the tall window on the third floor of the library, a small notebook on his lap. He would look at the patterns of light falling on the floor through the glass and start sketching equations around them. People thought he was daydreaming, but that was how his ideas were born, in silence, in moments that others didn't even notice. One afternoon, his professor walked into class holding a thick file of papers. "I want to talk about something special today," he said. "This is an open problem that mathematicians have tried to solve for decades. Some even say it's impossible." The room grew quiet. Everyone leaned forward. The professor explained that it wasn't just a math problem. It was a question about how numbers interacted in ways no one could fully explain. He listened carefully, every word sinking deep into his mind. Impossible. That word echoed again and again in his head. It wasn't the first time he'd heard it. When he was younger, people told him that thinking differently was impossible too. But here it was in a problem that no one had solved. Something about that challenge sparked something inside him. That night, while most students hung out in the dorms, he sat by his desk with a single lamp lighting his notes. He copied down the problem from memory and began thinking. It wasn't about fame or recognition. He simply wanted to understand why something could remain unsolved for so long. He believed every problem had a hidden pattern, and if he could find that pattern, maybe he could see what others couldn't. Days turned into weeks. Every spare moment he worked on it. During lectures, he'd scribble notes secretly. During lunch, he'd think about the relationships between shapes and numbers. He stopped noticing time. His friends started to worry, asking him to relax, but he couldn't. It wasn't an obsession for success. It was curiosity. He made dozens of notebooks full of ideas, some wild, some beautiful, some that didn't make sense at all. But he kept them all. He believed that even wrong paths had value. Sometimes the wrong way led to the right idea later. His room slowly filled with papers, graphs, and half-written equations. He didn't care how messy it got. Every page felt like a piece of his journey. One evening, while he was sitting in the library, his professor walked by and noticed him buried in books. "You're still working on that?" the professor asked with a soft smile. He nodded. "I just want to see if I can find something." The professor didn't stop him. He simply said, "Remember, sometimes understanding the question is more important than finding the answer." Those words stayed with him. He began approaching the problem differently. Instead of attacking it with formulas, he started observing it. He looked for patterns like he used to when he was younger. He treated the numbers as if they were part of nature, like the way branches split or waves curved. He began sketching graphs and shapes no one had drawn before. They weren't official methods, but they made sense to him. Slowly, he started to see something, a structure hidden beneath all the chaos of numbers. But progress wasn't easy. Every time he thought he had found the key, it slipped away again. Some nights he would sit for hours, staring at a single line of his notebook, unsure what to do next. Doubt crept in again. He started questioning himself. Was he wasting time? Was everyone right about him after all? He remembered the professor who had once told him to keep feeling right. But now even his feelings were confusing. He wanted to give up, yet something deep inside refused to let him. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He reminded himself that every great idea begins as a mistake that someone refuses to abandon. One day, while he was sitting under a tree near the campus garden, something unexpected happened. He was watching the sunlight filtering through the leaves, and for a moment, his mind went completely still. He noticed how the shadows formed repeating shapes on the ground, not perfect but consistent in their rhythm. Suddenly, he saw a connection between those natural patterns and the way his equations behaved. His eyes widened. He pulled out his notebook and started sketching fast, connecting dots between geometry and the sequence of numbers he'd been studying. It was the first time he felt close to something real. His heart raced. Could nature itself hold the secret to this impossible problem? He didn't have proof yet, but his intuition told him he was on the right path. He started studying the patterns of nature, tree branches, ripples in water, the spiral of shells, even the way birds flocked. He compared those to mathematical sequences, and slowly a picture began to form. It wasn't about solving the problem in the usual sense. It was about understanding the balance that existed behind it. His friends thought he was becoming strange. "You're studying trees for a math problem?" one of them asked, half laughing. But he didn't mind. He knew he was seeing something new, something that connected math with the living world. Months passed like this. His professors noticed his dedication but didn't expect anything big to come from it. After all, many had tried and failed before him. But he kept working silently, building his ideas piece by piece. Sometimes, when he couldn't sleep, he'd walk outside and look up at the stars. He would think about how even the universe followed mathematical laws. If the stars could follow patterns unseen by the eye, then maybe this problem wasn't impossible. Maybe it was just waiting for someone to look at it differently. He began developing his own theory, a way to describe the relationship between irregular shapes and predictable outcomes. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was new. Every day he would test it, adjust it, and test again. Slowly, the fragments started to align. One rainy evening, he sat by the window with a hot cup of tea and his favorite pencil. He looked at the storm outside, the rhythm of the raindrops hitting the glass. Each drop was random, yet together they created a pattern. Suddenly it hit him. His entire problem might not be about finding one perfect answer. Maybe it was about finding a system where imperfections themselves made sense. He stayed up all night writing. When the sun rose, his table was covered in papers and his hands were trembling from excitement. He didn't know it yet, but what he had written down that night would become the seed of the theory that would one day change everything. The next morning, he carried his notes to class, hesitant but hopeful. His professor glanced at them and smiled kindly. "You've been busy," he said. "Why don't you show me what you've been working on?" He explained his thoughts, his words a mix of confidence and nervousness. The professor didn't interrupt. When he finished, the room was quiet. Finally, the professor said, This is unusual. But there's something here." Those words made his heart race. For the first time, someone acknowledged that his strange thinking had value. That day, as he walked out of the classroom, he felt lighter. He wasn't done yet, not even close. But now he had direction. He had a reason to keep going. What began as curiosity had turned into a mission. And somewhere deep down, he knew that this problem, the one everyone called impossible, was about to take him on a journey that would not only change his life but also reshape the way people thought about mathematics forever. He didn't know it yet, but his quiet determination was about to lead him to a discovery that would turn the impossible into something beautifully simple. The days that followed were filled with quiet energy. He woke up earlier than usual and walked through the campus with his notebook in hand, his mind constantly alive with thoughts. It felt as if something invisible had started guiding him toward an answer that was waiting to be found. For the first time, he didn't feel lost. Every question he asked now seemed to open a small door inside his mind, leading to something deeper. He began spending more time in the university lab where research students worked. The lab was usually quiet, filled with papers, chalkboards covered in strange symbols, and half-empty cups of coffee. He didn't officially belong there, but no one stopped him. They had all seen his dedication. Even the professor who once called the problem impossible had grown curious about what he was doing. Every evening after classes ended, he would sit alone at one of the long wooden tables. He'd write until midnight, his handwriting becoming smaller as the pages filled up. Sometimes he'd pause and stare at the ceiling, trying to imagine what numbers would look like if they were alive, if they could breathe and move, like the patterns of wind or the curve of light. He had started combining his earlier idea that natural patterns held mathematical meaning, and with this unsolved problem, slowly he began to see a structure forming. It was still blurry, but it was there, hiding just beneath the surface. He felt as though the universe was whispering to him through numbers. One night he couldn't sleep. The sky outside his window was dark and filled with stars. He sat up in bed thinking about the shape of a wave he had seen earlier that day at the river. It kept replaying in his head how it curved, broke, and then disappeared only to form again. There was something so natural about it, yet it followed a hidden logic. He suddenly grabbed his notebook and began drawing. Line after line, curve after curve, until he realized something that made his heart skip a beat. The same type of pattern appeared in his mathematical problem. It was as if the wave had given him the key. He stayed up the rest of the night translating that shape into numbers. His hands were shaking from excitement. Every part of the problem that once looked impossible was now beginning to take form through this simple but powerful connection. The next morning, when he looked at what he had written, his eyes filled with tears. For years he had been chasing something he couldn't explain, and now it was finally starting to make sense. It wasn't perfect yet. There were still many gaps. But he knew this was the direction he had been searching for. He started testing his idea in different ways, using examples from nature, physics, and even art. The more he compared, the more everything aligned. He realized that his discovery wasn't just a solution to one question, it was a new way to see mathematics. But as exciting as it was, he couldn't celebrate yet. He needed proof. He needed to make sure his theory could survive under pressure. So he began cross-checking every formula, every assumption over and over again. Days turned into nights. His friends stopped seeing him in the cafeteria. He skipped gatherings, meals, even sleep. People thought he was overworking himself, but he didn't care. When passion takes over, time stops mattering. One evening, while sitting in the lab, he heard footsteps behind him. It was his professor. "You're still here?" the professor asked softly. He nodded, too focused to look up. The professor walked closer and saw the papers spread across the table. After a moment of silence, he said, "You've come far. But remember, real discovery needs patience." He looked up and smiled faintly. "I know," he said, "but I feel like I'm close." The professor nodded, impressed but concerned. "Close is good," he said, "but make sure you rest. The mind needs calm to see clearly." After the professor left, he sat quietly, the room lit only by the yellow light of a desk lamp. The words "the mind needs calm" kept echoing in his head. Maybe the professor was right. Maybe he was trying too hard. So he closed his notebooks, put down his pencil, and decided to take a walk. The night air was cool and still. The city outside the campus was quiet, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the road. He walked slowly, breathing deeply, letting his thoughts settle. And that's when it happened, the moment that would change everything. As he passed a small cafe, he noticed the reflection of a flickering light in a puddle of water. The pattern of that flicker, inconsistent yet repeating, reminded him of the equations he'd been studying. He stopped walking, his eyes fixed on the reflection. The pattern was not random. It moved with rhythm, like a language of numbers written in light. He took out his notebook and began sketching right there on the sidewalk. He compared the curve of the light's reflection with the graphs he had drawn earlier. Something inside him clicked. The same pattern that appeared in the wave, the same pattern in the trees and the star, it was all connected. His problem wasn't a single equation to solve. It was a system of balance. His hand trembled as he wrote faster, lines filling the page. He felt a rush of emotion, like every puzzle piece he had collected over the years was falling into place at last. He understood it now, not through memorization or luck, but through deep observation. The answer had been in front of him all along, hidden in the world's simplest forms. He returned to his dorm in a hurry, barely able to contain his excitement. He spent the entire night refining his discovery. He created diagrams, notes, and explanations until the theory stood clearly on paper. When he looked at it again, he realized something that made his heart race. The solution didn't just solve the original problem. It introduced a new principle that could simplify many complex equations in modern mathematics. He couldn't believe it. It was as if a curtain had been lifted. For years, people had tried to make the problem harder, thinking complexity was the answer, but he had done the opposite. He had looked for simplicity, and simplicity had revealed the truth. By sunrise, he was exhausted but filled with quiet joy. He sat by his window, watching the light break through the sky. He whispered to himself, "It's all connected." The next day, he took his findings to his professor. His hands were shaking as he laid the pages on the table. The professor looked through them carefully, his face unreadable. Minutes passed in silence. Finally, the professor looked up, his eyes filled with disbelief. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "I made it," the young man said quietly. "It came from observing patterns buried in nature and movement in everything." The professor leaned back, his voice softer now. "Do you understand what you've done?" He shook his head. "I'm not sure," the professor smiled faintly. "You've done what most people never even try. You've changed the way we look at mathematics. This is new. This is pure insight." He didn't know how to react. His mind was spinning. He had expected feedback, maybe even criticism, but not this. For a long time, he just sat there, unable to speak. The professor placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Don't rush to share it yet. Test it more. Let it mature. The world isn't always ready for new ideas." Those words were both comforting and frightening. He wanted to tell everyone, to show how a simple idea could solve something thought impossible. But he understood what the professor meant. Many great discoveries had been ignored at first. He needed to be patient, so he continued refining his theory quietly, working through every small flaw he could find. He tested it again and again, and each time the results supported his belief. The more he studied, the more confident he became. One night, after hours of checking his work, he put down his pencil and leaned back in his chair. His room was silent except for the ticking of the clock. He looked at his notebooks, at the hundreds of pages filled with his thoughts. For the first time, he felt peace. It wasn't pride he felt, it was gratitude. Gratitude that he had never given up, that he had trusted his strange way of thinking, that he had seen beauty where others saw confusion. He realized that mathematics wasn't about numbers anymore. It was about understanding life itself, the flow, the rhythm, the endless balance between order and chaos. He didn't know how the world would react when they saw his discovery. But one thing was certain. From that night onward, nothing about mathematics, or the way people thought about it, would ever be the same again. The news of his discovery started spreading quietly at first. His professor, unable to keep the excitement to himself, shared the findings with a small circle of colleagues at the university. They looked at the work carefully, expecting to find a mistake, but what they saw surprised them. The idea was simple yet so powerful that it challenged their understanding of how numbers connected. It wasn't just a formula, it was a new way of thinking. A week later, he was invited to present his work to a small group of mathematicians and researchers. When he received the invitation, he didn't know how to feel. He had always been shy, the kind of person who preferred silence over attention. Now suddenly, people wanted to hear his thoughts. The night before the presentation, he couldn't sleep. His desk was covered with pages and notebooks, and he kept rehearsing in his mind how to explain his idea in simple words. The truth was, he didn't think of himself as a genius. He had only followed his curiosity, that quiet voice that told him to look deeper. He didn't care about fame or recognition. He just wanted others to understand the beauty he had found in the problem. When the morning came, the sun was bright, but his hands were cold. He stood in front of the classroom filled with experts, people far more experienced than him. He could see the doubt in their eyes. After all, who was he? Just a student. He took a deep breath and began to speak. His voice trembled at first, but as he explained, something changed. His passion took over. He spoke not like someone giving a lecture, but like someone telling a story. About patterns in trees, waves, and reflections. About how simplicity hides within chaos. Slowly, the room grew silent. The professors leaned forward, following every word. He drew diagrams on the board, showing how his method worked, how the unsolved problem could be approached from a completely different angle. He explained how irregular shapes could follow predictable patterns when looked at through his new perspective. When he finished, the room stayed quiet for a few moments. Then someone asked a question, then another and another. For over 2 hours, he answered questions with calm confidence. He didn't use complicated terms or heavy theory. He spoke plainly, explaining how he had seen the problem as a living thing, not a dead set of numbers. When it ended, one of the professors stood up, walked over and said quietly, "You've made us think differently." Those words meant more to him than any applause. After that day, things began to move quickly. The paper he wrote with his professor's help was sent to a mathematics journal. The reviewers were skeptical at first, but once they tested his method, they realized its potential. It not only worked for the old problem, it could be applied to many areas of mathematics that had been stuck for years. It was revolutionary. Soon, universities from other countries reached out asking to see his notes. Researchers began using his ideas to approach their own theories. In just a few months, his name, once unknown, started appearing in conferences and scientific discussions. But for him, none of that mattered as much as the feeling of finally being understood. For years, people had told him his way of thinking was strange, useless, even wrong. Now those same qualities were being celebrated. Still, he stayed humble. When people called him a prodigy, he shook his head and said, "I'm not a genius. I just looked at what was already there." He believed deeply that knowledge was not about competition, but connection. About seeing how everything, no matter how small, was part of a bigger pattern. One afternoon, as he walked across the campus, a group of students stopped him. They were nervous but excited. "Sir," one of them said shyly, "we watched your presentation online. The way you explained numbers, it made us see math differently." For the first time, it didn't feel scary. He smiled, surprised and touched. He had never imagined his ideas could inspire others, especially students who once felt the same fear of mathematics that he had seen growing up. That moment changed something in him. He realized that discovery meant little if it didn't help others see the beauty behind it. From then on, he began helping others understand his approach. He volunteered to tutor struggling students, teaching them how to find joy in the logic of numbers rather than fear. Instead of forcing them to memorize formulas, he showed them patterns in everyday life. How the petals of a flower followed symmetry, how sound waves moved like repeating curves. He made them see math instead of just doing it. His classes became popular not because they were easy, but because they were alive. Students left feeling like they had unlocked a secret language. Meanwhile, his theory continued to grow in influence. Conferences invited him to speak. At first, he hesitated, unsure of how to face large audiences, but each time he spoke, more people listened. What made him special wasn't just his discovery, it was his way of explaining it, his ability to make complex things simple. However, not everyone accepted his ideas easily. Some traditional mathematicians argued that his approach was too abstract, too emotional. They preferred rigid logic, but even they couldn't deny the results. Over time, even the harshest critics had to admit that his method worked. It was during one of these conferences that he experienced a moment that would stay with him forever. After his talk, an elderly professor approached him. She had spent her entire career studying similar problems. She shook his hand and said, "You reminded me why I fell in love with mathematics in the first place." That simple sentence meant more to him than any award. Back at his university, his professor proudly watched his former student become a quiet symbol of creativity and perseverance. They would often meet in the same lab where it all began, sharing tea and discussing new ideas. The professor once said, "You know, what you did was more than solving a problem. You changed how people see thinking itself." He smiled softly. "I just followed what made sense to me," he said. But the world was already calling it something greater. Newspapers began writing about the young mind who saw numbers differently. Universities invited him to lead seminars. Even those outside the field of mathematics, artists, engineers, and musicians, found meaning in his ideas. They saw how patterns connected everything: sound, color, rhythm, and life. Yet through all this attention, he stayed the same quiet person. He still carried his small notebook everywhere. He still observed the world with the same childlike curiosity. Fame didn't interest him. What mattered most was the pursuit of understanding. One evening, after giving a talk at a nearby school, he sat alone in the courtyard as the sun began to set. Children's laughter echoed from the playground, and he watched as they played, carefree and curious. He smiled, remembering his own childhood, the boy who once sat alone, misunderstood, drawing shapes on a scrap of paper. He realized something profound in that moment. Maybe the greatest discoveries aren't born in loud rooms filled with applause. Maybe they start quietly, in the hearts of people who simply refuse to stop wondering. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind. The same patterns he once saw in numbers he could now feel in life itself. The rhythm of footsteps, the hum of the world around him. Everything followed a kind of order, even in chaos. His discovery had begun as an attempt to solve a problem, but it had become something far bigger. A bridge between logic and beauty, between knowledge and curiosity. And even though the world now saw him as a thinker who changed mathematics forever, he knew the truth. He had only seen what was always there, hidden in plain sight. In the quiet that evening, as the sky turned from gold to gray, he smiled to himself. He wasn't chasing answers anymore. He was living inside them. Years passed quietly after his discovery had made its way into classrooms, research papers, and documentaries. The excitement that had once surrounded his name slowly turned into quiet respect. People no longer saw him as just a young genius. They saw him as a thinker who had reshaped something deep in the way the world understood learning itself. He still lived a simple life. He preferred early mornings when the world was silent. He would sit near the window with a cup of tea and a notebook, not to chase another discovery, but to write down small ideas that crossed his mind. Sometimes he doodled equations. Sometimes he wrote thoughts about nature. He no longer worked for recognition. He worked for understanding. He spent more time teaching now, not in big universities or on grand stages, but in small classrooms filled with students who once believed mathematics was not for them. He would stand at the front of the class, chalk in hand, and start not with formulas but with questions. "What do you see when you look at a circle?" he would ask. Some would say a shape. Others would shrug. He'd smile and say, "Look closer. It's not just a shape. It's a story without an end. That was how he taught, not to impress but to inspire. He made his students curious again, the way he had once been as a boy. He reminded them that numbers were not walls but windows, and through them they could see how everything connected. One afternoon, after a long lecture, a student stayed behind. She looked nervous, holding her notebook tightly. "Sir," she said softly, "I've never been good at math, but since your class I feel like I can understand it for the first time. It doesn't scare me anymore." He looked at her for a moment and smiled. "That means you've already succeeded," he said. "Understanding is not about being fast or perfect. It's about not giving up when something feels too big." Moments like that reminded him why he had chosen this quiet path. While others ran after awards or big titles, he found meaning in the smallest changes. A student's smile, a spark of curiosity, a new way of seeing the world. His theory continued to influence new fields of study. Scientists used it to understand natural patterns. Economists applied it to analyze unpredictable trends. Artists found inspiration in it, creating designs based on his formulas. Even musicians claimed his approach helped them see rhythm differently. It was as if his idea had escaped the limits of mathematics and entered life itself. But he never claimed it as his own victory. When people praised him, he would always say, "It was never about me. It was about seeing things differently." He knew that every great idea was not created by one person alone. It was the result of countless minds thinking, failing, and trying again through time. One day, he received an invitation to an international conference being held in another country. It was dedicated entirely to exploring the impact of his discovery on modern mathematics. For years, he had avoided large public events, but this time he felt it was important to go, not to speak but to listen. When he arrived, he was surprised by what he saw. The hall was filled with researchers, teachers, and students from around the world. His theory had become the foundation for dozens of new ideas. People used it in ways he had never imagined. It was humbling. He sat quietly in the audience as speaker after speaker discussed his work. Some showed new proofs, some shared experiments, and others spoke about how his approach had changed how they teach. Listening to them, he felt something warm inside. He realized that his once small discovery had become a language that others now spoke fluently. When it was his turn to speak, he walked to the stage slowly. The room went quiet. He looked around and said gently, "When I first started working on this, I didn't think I was creating something new. I was just trying to understand something old, something that had been waiting for us to notice. What I found wasn't an answer. It was a new way of asking questions." The crowd listened in silence. He spoke not like a scientist, but like someone sharing a story. He talked about how curiosity should never be replaced by fear, how simplicity often hides the deepest truths, and how every person, no matter their skill, has the ability to think differently. When he finished, the audience stood and clapped for a long time. After the conference, people came to meet him. Some wanted advice, some wanted signatures, but many just wanted to say thank you. A teacher from a small village told him, "Your idea helped my students believe they could be thinkers too." He nodded with a smile, feeling deeply moved. When he returned home, he didn't see himself as a famous figure. He went back to his quiet routine, the morning tea, the notebook, the classroom. But now he felt at peace. He knew his purpose was not just to solve problems, but to inspire others to look for beauty where others saw difficulty. As the years went on, his health began to weaken. Long nights of research and endless travel had taken their toll. Yet even when his body grew tired, his mind stayed sharp and curious. On days when he couldn't walk much, he would sit near the window, watching the rain hit the glass, tracing invisible patterns with his finger. Sometimes former students came to visit. They brought stories of their own, about how they had become teachers, researchers, or simply people who approached life with curiosity. One of them once said, "Sir, your way of thinking changed how I see the world. Not just in numbers, but in everything." He smiled and said, "Then you've learned the real lesson." He never wrote another big paper. He didn't need to. His discovery had already become part of how the world learned and thought. In textbooks, his idea was now taught as a turning point in modern mathematics. But for him, the greatest legacy wasn't his theory. It was the people it inspired. On a quiet evening, as he sat by the window watching the fading light, he thought about his life. He remembered the boy who once stayed up late trying to solve impossible questions, the nights filled with self-doubt, the moment of discovery, and all the faces of students who found joy in learning again. It all felt connected, like numbers in a pattern, each moment leading to the next. He realized that his journey was never just about solving a mathematical mystery. It was about proving something much bigger, that the human mind, when guided by patience and curiosity, could find beauty even in the most complex problems. The sun slowly dipped below the horizon and the room grew dim. He closed his notebook one last time and smiled. He knew that long after he was gone, people would continue building on what he started. His solution had become more than a piece of mathematics. It had become a symbol of human imagination, proof that one person's way of seeing the world could change how everyone else understood it. In the end, he didn't leave behind riches or fame. He left behind something far greater, a new way of thinking. And somewhere, in classrooms across the world, a young student would one day look at a simple math problem and see it differently, not as a task to fear, but as a puzzle to wonder at. That was his true legacy. Not the formulas, not the recognition, but the spark of curiosity he passed on to others, a spark that would keep burning long after his time, reminding people that even the most difficult questions have beauty hidden inside them, waiting for someone brave enough to look closer. Years after his passing, his story continued to live quietly, whispered in classrooms, discussed in lecture halls, and remembered by those who had met him. The university where he had once taught set up a small room in his honor. It wasn't grand or filled with shiny awards. It was simple, a wooden desk, a chalkboard with faint equations still visible, and a small window looking out onto the courtyard where he used to sit. People who visited said that when sunlight came through that window in the morning, it felt as if the room itself carried his calm spirit, peaceful, thoughtful, patient. The kind of presence that reminded others that true greatness often lives in simplicity. His notebooks, once scattered across his desk, were carefully collected and preserved. Inside there were not only mathematical notes but also reflections on life. Some pages had only a few lines written in his neat handwriting. Every number has a rhythm. Questions are more beautiful than answers. The smallest pattern can hold the biggest truth. Those who read his words often felt moved by how deeply he connected logic with emotion. To him, numbers were not just symbols. They were expressions of life's balance, mirrors of nature's order, proof that everything, no matter how chaotic, had meaning if you looked closely enough. Over time, students from around the world began visiting his university. Some came to study his theories. Others came simply to sit in the room and feel inspired. It became a quiet tradition among young mathematicians to leave a piece of chalk by his desk in a simple gesture of respect for the man who changed how people thought about thinking itself. One of his former students, now a respected professor herself, once said in a lecture, "He taught us that mathematics isn't about getting the right answer. It's about finding the right way to see." Those words spread far and wide, shared by teachers who wanted their students to understand that curiosity, not perfection, is what drives discovery. His work also began to reach places he had never imagined. A group of scientists used his approach to study weather patterns and found more accurate ways to predict storms. Artists used his formulas to create breathtaking designs and digital art. Musicians even turned his equations into melodies, translating patterns of numbers into sound. It was as if his way of thinking had woven itself into every corner of creativity. But beyond all that recognition, what truly lasted was his influence on education. Teachers started to change how they taught. Instead of forcing students to memorize formulas, they encouraged them to explore ideas. Instead of treating mistakes as failures, they treated them as steps toward understanding. His philosophy quietly reshaped the relationship between learning and fear. In one small town school far from the city, a teacher told her students a story about a young man who once struggled to fit in because he thought differently. She described how he had been mocked, ignored, and misunderstood, until the day his way of seeing things changed the entire field of mathematics. Her students listened with wide eyes. One of them, a boy who often stayed quiet during lessons, raised his hand and said softly, "So it's okay if I see things differently?" She smiled and nodded. "It's more than okay. That's how change begins." That single sentence, shared in hundreds of classrooms over the years, became part of his invisible legacy. His name might not have been on every textbook cover, but his way of thinking lived in the hearts of students who dared to question, imagine, and see beyond the surface. Years later, a documentary was made about his life. It wasn't dramatic or filled with fancy effects. It was simple, just like he had been. The filmmakers interviewed people who knew him, his old professor, his students, even the janitor who used to see him working late at night. Each one spoke about his kindness, his patience, and the quiet way he changed everything without ever asking for attention. In one emotional scene, his former professor, now elderly and fragile, said with a soft smile, he wasn't trying to change the world. He was just trying to understand it. And maybe that's why he did. When the documentary was released, it touched millions. People who had never cared about mathematics before found themselves thinking differently, not about numbers, but about the beauty of curiosity, the courage to question, and the quiet strength of patience. Even years later, quotes from his notebooks appeared in places he would have never expected, in business seminars, motivational talks, and art galleries. People found meaning in his simple thoughts. One of his lines became especially famous: patterns are not made to be solved. They are made to be seen. It became a symbol of open-mindedness, reminding people in every field that understanding the world starts with noticing what others overlook. One of the most touching stories came from a child who had seen the documentary. He was only 11, struggling with school, especially with math. He wrote a letter to the university, addressed to the man who made math beautiful. The letter was filled with innocent words. I don't like math, but my teacher told me about you. I saw the movie and now I want to try again. I think maybe I can find my own way to see numbers. Thank you for showing me that it's okay to be slow as long as I'm curious. That letter was placed in a frame and hung on the wall of the small memorial room. Visitors who read it often felt their eyes fill with tears. It was proof that his story still touched new generations, not through complicated theories, but through the simple power of inspiration. Decades later, scholars continued to expand on his work. His method evolved, leading to new discoveries in data science, geometry, and even artificial intelligence. Some said his approach had laid the foundation for how machines now learn to recognize patterns. Even technology, built on logic and precision, had been shaped by the heart of a man who once believed that understanding starts with wonder. And yet, no matter how far his ideas reached, those who studied his life always came back to one truth: he never chased greatness. Greatness found him because he stayed true to what mattered: curiosity, kindness, and the belief that knowledge is meant to be shared. In time, a statue was built in his memory at the university courtyard where he used to sit. It wasn't grand or dramatic. It showed him sitting on a bench, notebook in hand, looking slightly upward, as if still thinking, still searching for the next pattern hidden in the sky. On the base of the statue were engraved his own words: to understand the world, first learn to see it. Every spring, when flowers bloomed around that statue, students gathered to celebrate his birthday. They didn't call it a ceremony, they called it the Day of Curiosity. They shared stories, solved problems, drew patterns, and reminded one another that learning was not about speed or grades, but about seeing with heart and mind together. Sometimes, late in the evening, when the campus was quiet, a few students would sit near that statue, talking softly about life, about struggles, and about dreams. And even though he was long gone, his presence still felt alive in those conversations, like a gentle voice reminding them, keep looking even when no one understands you. And that was how his story never truly ended. His solution may have changed mathematics, but his vision changed something far greater: the way people saw knowledge itself. He proved that the greatest discoveries are not made by those who seek fame, but by those who seek truth with patience and love.